Radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Arlene Foster and here's what's coming up over the next hour. The National Grid has announced yesterday that the worst case scenario for this winter could be blackouts lasting 3 hours. Liz Truss has had a day to catch her breath from the chaotic Tory conference. Her speech was moderately well received, but she's not out of the woods yet. And today, a GB News People's poll has put Labour 32 points ahead. Plus, President Biden has said the world is at its highest nuclear threat since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll be joined by former commander of US forces in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Also, give me your political briefing. Send in your views and opinions by emailing gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. First of all, here's the news with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Arlene. Good afternoon. It's coming up to 2 minutes past 3, your top stories from the GB newsroom. The UK and Ireland have said they'll work towards trying to resolve the stalemate over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Following a meeting of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference in London, both parties issued a joint statement. In it, they reaffirmed their commitment to reinstate an executive at Stormont by October the 28th. Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney said his country was now in a different space with the UK, with a genuine effort from both sides to resolve the issues. Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris stressed the importance of an executive being formed.
I think it's vitally important that the executive reforms in Northern Ireland, for all the reasons I've given previously about the quality of public services, the interventions on energy that we need to give, and are finding quite difficult to do so in a Northern Ireland context. We will get there, but it will be much better and much more efficiently delivered by having an executive in place.
The US president says the world is facing the biggest threat of nuclear Armageddon since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. Joe Biden says Russia's president wasn't joking when he threatened to use nuclear weapons after suffering setbacks in Ukraine. It follows a warning from Vladimir Putin that he'd use all means necessary to protect Russian soil, which he says now includes the 4 recently annexed Ukrainian regions. Former NATO commander Chris Parry told GB News we shouldn't underestimate Putin.
There's distinct saber rattling by the Russians because they themselves are rattled by what's happened in Ukraine. And secondly, we've seen a pattern with American diplomacy whereby they try and out threats before they appear. And it's a method of deterring the other side from actually doing something. I don't see the crisis being as bad as that as in 1963. But we shouldn't underestimate the fact that there are certain circumstances under which I think Vladimir Putin would resort to nuclear weapons.
The government has opened a new licensing round for oil and gas exploration in the North Sea, the first since 2019. As many as 100 licences could be granted in a bid to encourage production of new oil and gas supplies as quickly as possible. Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg says it'll boost the UK's economy, energy security and support skilled jobs. Meanwhile, the government isn't telling people to reduce their overall energy consumption. That's despite warnings yesterday the UK may have to implement blackouts. Climate Minister Graham Stewart said instead of stopping people from using energy, the government's looking at incentivising people to reduce their usage, particularly during peak times. It follows the warning from the National Grid electricity system operator that although unlikely, households may face 3-hour power outages this winter. Thailand is mourning the death of at least 34 people, including 23 children, some as young as 2, following yesterday's massacre at a nursery. Government buildings are flying flags at half-mast and the first funeral's been held for some of the victims. Police say the attacker, Panya Kamrab, had been discharged from the force last year and just hours earlier had appeared in court on drugs charges. He also killed his wife and child before taking his own life. Metropolitan Police has announced a new unit to root out criminal behaviour among officers and staff in the force. Its Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, says the Anti-Corruption and Abuse Command will target those that corrupt the integrity of the force. It comes amid a series of scandals, including the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving officer and inappropriate text messages shared in WhatsApp groups. Over 3,000 more people died than usual in England and Wales this summer as the UK endured record temperatures. That's the highest figure since 2004. Most of the deaths were those aged 65 or over, and many happened during the hottest days towards the end of July. The data comes from a report from the Office for National Statistics and the UK Health Security Agency. A 14-year-old boy has been charged with murder following the fatal stabbing of another teenager in Gateshead. Tomasz Oleszak, also 14, was found with serious injuries near the Springwell estate on Monday evening. He died in hospital in the early hours of Tuesday. Northumbria Police says the teenager, who can't be named for legal reasons, was due to appear at Newcastle Magistrates Court this morning. The force says the 13-year-old girl, who was arrested on suspicion of assisting an offender, has been bailed. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back to the briefing with Arlene Foster.
Welcome back to the briefing, and I'm delighted to say that throughout the programme today I'm joined by Henry Hill, who's the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home. But we're going to look first at Anglo-European relations, and Prime Minister Liz Truss is back from a one-day summit with more than 40 European leaders, where she declared that French President Emmanuel Macron is a friend. But as she heads back to a country in economic turmoil and the splits in government that were on show earlier this week at the Tory conference, will she be able to unite them next week when Parliament resumes? Delighted to say that I'm now joined by former Cabinet Minister David Lidington, who served as Deputy to Theresa May when she was Prime Minister. David, thanks for coming on the show today. And obviously we've been watching the different conferences, and unfortunately for the Conservative Party, just a month after Liz Truss was appointed as your leader, there were some divisions on show. Do you think those will end now that we're heading back to Parliament and back to a very full agenda?
I wish I could say they would, Arlene. But good to join you, by the way. But I don't quite see it happen. I mean, I went up to Birmingham for part of the conference, and the mood amongst Conservative MPs to whom I spoke was pretty gloomy. And people are looking at the opinion polls. They're obviously drawing conclusions from those about their own chances of survival at the next election. Next election was always going to be very tough. The Conservatives would have been in office for perhaps 14 years by the time we go to the polls, but I don't think it's an unwinnable one. What I think Liz Truss and her cabinet colleagues have to do is to start by trying to show that the cabinet will stick together, because certainly at Birmingham there was too much briefing by one cabinet minister against another cabinet minister throughout the conference. Secondly, they've got to find a way to have an economic strategy that both reassures the international market, the people who lend us the money to keep us going, but at the same time is credible in Parliament. There's no point about promising something to the market that relies on legislation for cuts in public spending, say, that you can't get a majority for in the House of Commons. And that's a tall order. But I wish the Prime Minister well, and I think it seems to me that is what she needs to focus on. It's that economic strategy that is credible with the market and credible in Parliament.
Well, you will know, David, better than many people I speak to, that this being Prime Minister is a juggling act, and she left Birmingham to go to that European summit. And as former Europe Minister, you must have been pleased to see the rapprochement that happened there and the fact that there seems to be better mood music now between the different players.
I was delighted that the Prime Minister decided to go to the Prague meeting, and I've been further encouraged today when it's come out that the United Kingdom is going to take part in something called PESCO. It's an EU scheme that allows the easy transfer and mobility of troops and military equipment across the whole of Europe. The US and Norway, our fellow NATO members, were already part of this scheme. We'd held back. We've now gone in. That seems to be sensible, pragmatic. It's not some betrayal of Brexit. I mean, it's no secret. I was an ardent Remainer, and I still haven't changed my mind. But the decision was taken. The people voted, and that decision had to be accepted in a democracy. The question now is, outside the EU, how do we establish the best possible relationship with the other democracies of our own continent to meet the challenges that we all face? The challenge from Russian aggression in Ukraine and that Russian threat to all democracies in Europe, the challenge of energy security, the challenge of climate change. And I think that both Liz Truss's action in going to Prague, but also the sort of language that's been coming from her and from James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, is a very big improvement, I think, in some of the negative rhetoric we've had in the past. And I was very struck at Birmingham. I talked to a number of ambassadors from EU member countries, and they told me that they had noticed a very distinct change in the tone of the language being used by senior British cabinet ministers about how they now wanted to establish a different sort of constructive partnership, working relationship in all our interests amongst the European democracies.
And finally, David, continuing that theme of positivity, I'm sure you've been pleased to see the discussions happening today at the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference at Lancaster House in London between Simon Coveney for the Republic of Ireland and, of course, Chris Heaton-Harris from the Northern Ireland Secretary. What do you think is going to happen now in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol?
There seems to be political will on both sides, though, to try to find a way forward and to try to do a deal. Look, both you and I, Arlene, have been around this course a number of times, and we know how complex this is going to be. I think that both sides need to move, is my view. I think that the EU, having looked at what's happened since Brexit took place, ought to be able to conclude that the actual level of risk to the single market from goods moving across the border on the island of Ireland is pretty small, and that therefore the precautions that they demand of us should be less onerous as a result. I think that from the UK side, I think there probably is a need to compromise on the European Court, which by treaty is the body that decides what is and what isn't European law, what European law actually means. And I think probably we need to involve Stormont more than has been suggested in the past. For example, agricultural standards. I mean, Northern Ireland's always been part of a single animal health area with the Republic of Ireland. Well, are there things to do with plant and animal health checks and food checks where you could say these are normally things that would be devolved to Stormont? Why don't we let Stormont decide about whether they want to align with EU standards for a period in the future to ensure less friction in trade, or whether Stormont wants to do something different and accept the additional friction. So, but I think, however you cut it, bringing Stormont, the elected representatives of the people of Northern Ireland, more into the picture seems to me to be an integral part of it if there's going to be a deal.
David, lovely to speak to you, and thank you so much for joining me this afternoon and being as thoughtful as ever. Thank you. Now, we've been discussing, as the dust settles off the Labour and Conservative Party conferences and the politicians return to Westminster, a GB News People's poll has given Sir Keir Starmer's party a 32-point lead. Joining me now to discuss the past few weeks is the chief political commentator of The Independent, John Rentoul. John, 32 points ahead. That's quite something, isn't it?
It's. I mean, I haven't seen anything like it in my whole career as a political journalist. Nothing has happened this fast. I mean, you can go back to the coronavirus when the government, Boris Johnson, got a bit of a boost at the start, and from the vaccines. You can go back to 1992 to the devaluation crisis under John Major. I mean, that really did have a terrible effect on the Conservative Party's reputation. But that happened over months. I mean, if you look at the graph, there's nothing that I've ever seen that looks like this.
And you were watching very closely what was going on in Liverpool and Birmingham at both conferences. What was your big takeaway from, first of all, the Labour Party conference and secondly then the Conservative conference?
Well, the Labour Party conference was happening before Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did their U-turn on the top rate tax cut. So the full extent of the damage, the destruction of political capital that the Conservatives managed was not evident by the time that the Labour Party met. But even so, things were looking pretty good for them because Liz Truss had such a bad start and the reception for the mini budget was so poor that Labour people were struggling to avoid looking smug because obviously this is a very serious national crisis and they don't want to look as if they're enjoying it in any way. But the prospect of power certainly animated them, and you certainly felt that they really think that they can form a government at the next election.
And the Conservative Party, what's your big takeaway from that, if it's not too obvious a question for you?
Well, I was almost surprised when I got to Birmingham that there weren't, because I arrived after the U-turn. I was almost surprised that there weren't sort of dead bodies on the podium. What was really striking was a lot of private conversations, how much Conservatives hate each other. And I think they have done so much damage to themselves through that leadership election. It wasn't fought in a very comradely spirit. The two sides of the party really don't like each other, and anyone trying to unite them is going to have one big job on their hands.
Well, John, thanks for your thoughts this afternoon. I'm now joined in the studio by a man who knows a little bit about the Conservative Party, and that's Henry Hill, Deputy Editor at Conservative Home. Well, you heard John Rentoul talk about the Conservative Party conference. You were there.
I was, alas.
What was your... I think I know what you're going to say now. What was your take on the conference this year?
I mean, basically, it was almost as if, you know that moment in a cartoon when someone's running on air because they've run out of ground but they haven't realised it yet? It was sort of like that, because even as bleak as some of the mood in the fringe events was, it wasn't as bleak as it should be given where the polls are.
Yeah.
So there was this air of unreality about the whole thing, and you get the impression that in a few weeks the mood in the party is going to be an awful lot bleaker, not just because the polls are going to have sunk in, but because you talk to people in government about, the Liz Truss stabilised the markets by saying that she'd match her tax cuts with spending cuts. And you talk to people in government about how they're going to deliver these spending cuts, and they can't. There's absolutely no way of doing it. They've got to find £45 billion
and the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, it's like they've got to find £45 billion, and they can't find it. So in a few weeks' time, Liz Truss is going to either have to deliver a package of spending cuts, which includes steep cuts to pensions, health, schools, not going to happen, or she's going to have to completely back down on the tax cuts, end of her premiership, or she's going to have to start and try and borrow it. Markets go crazy. So I think there's a real sense amongst Tory MPs and activists that this is a government that's really running on borrowed time. And what surprised me most about the conference, actually, was how much it was priced in that she won't be leading the Conservatives into the next election.
That's quite a shocking statement, given that she's only been in office for just a month.
It's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it. I've not been covering politics quite as long as John has, but nonetheless, it was remarkable the extent to which, even a few weeks ago, people were saying, even if they didn't vote for her, we can't have another change of leadership. But now they're saying, look, it's a question of shaving 6 or 7 points off the defeat in 2024.
My goodness, incredible. Well, the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference started today, and with a more positive tone ahead on Brexit talks to resume in the coming days. And our political reporter has the latest on that. after the break. But let's look at the weather now.
Hello again, Aidan McGivern here with the latest forecast from the Met Office. A spell of heavy rain and strong winds is crossing the country this afternoon. Showers following, and then all of that clears later, with most places seeing a dry and clear night. But an active weather front is causing some lively weather. With that front, we're seeing a spell of heavy rain, gusty winds, those winds really picking up as the heavy rain pushes through, and it clears southeast England around late evening, followed by a marked temperature drop and lighter winds with clear spells for many overnight, and as a result temperatures will fall away. Now there will still be some showers in the north and northwest, but where we see the clear spells elsewhere, those temperatures dipping in sheltered spots down to 5 or even down to 2 to 3 Celsius. A bright start though, despite that chill in the air first thing this weekend. Plenty of sunshine for many during the morning. I think some cloud will build, but for the vast majority it's going to stay dry and bright with sunny spells. One exception, western Scotland, where there will still be further showers along with a keen breeze and a bit more cloud building later in the day. 12 to 14 Celsius for Scotland, 15 for Northern Ireland, 16 or 17 for England and Wales. And light winds as well, which means that overnight, once again, clear skies and temperatures falling away. So for England and Wales, it's a chilly night on Saturday night, and temperatures in some sheltered spots first thing Sunday, around 2 to 5 Celsius once again. However, for Northern Ireland, for Scotland, it turns cloudier, it turns breezier, and the first signs of some wet weather pushing back into the west of Scotland by dawn on Sunday. And it looks like for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, Sunday will increasingly be an unsettled day with heavy rain and strong winds moving through, gales in exposed coastal areas. But for England and Wales, it stays mainly dry. Monday sees drier and brighter weather for all, feeling warm in the south.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne. At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the briefing. Well, the Northern Ireland Secretary of State, Chris Heaton-Harris, has insisted that another Assembly election will be held in the region if power sharing is not restored by October the 28th. He and the Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, were speaking after a meeting of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference in central London this afternoon.
I'm under a duty to call an election on the 28th. I think it's vitally important that the executive reforms in Northern Ireland, for all reasons I've given previously about the quality of public services, the interventions on energy that we need to give, and are finding quite difficult to do so in a Northern Ireland context. We will get there, but it'll be much better and much more efficiently delivered by having an executive in place. So I'm under no illusions as to the issues around it, but yes, I will be calling an election on the 28th of October if we do not have an executive reformed.
Well, joining us now from central London is Arlene Foster, our political correspondent, who's down in Lancaster House, where the Intergovernmental Conference took place. Catherine, there seems to be a better mood between the Irish and the United Kingdom's representatives. Is that the case?
Yes, absolutely. And time really is of the essence, as we were hearing, because the date approaching the 28th of October, when Chris Heaton-Harris would need to call elections, if an agreement has not been reached. Of course, the government instalment has not been sitting because power sharing has collapsed. Democratic Unionist Party, as you know only too well, Arlene, won't go back into power sharing while these concerns over the Northern Irish Protocol are unaddressed. It does sound like both sides are listening and becoming much more emollient and talking the language of getting a deal. I mean, we had Steve Baker, arch-Brexiteer, who's now Minister for Northern Ireland, earlier in the week, didn't we? Apologising basically for saying that they hadn't always gone about things in perhaps the best way. We also had Leo Varadkar, Deputy Irish Prime Minister, saying that perhaps the Irish and the EU had enforced these checks rather more strictly than they might have. I was at the press conference afterwards and also the first 5 minutes of the meeting, which started about 11 o'clock. And Simon Coveney, Irish Foreign Minister, was really keen to stress that the change of tone, he said, had been recognised by both Dublin and by Brussels. He's talking about the change of tone of the UK, but also I would say there has definitely been a change of tone coming from the EU and indeed from Dublin as well. They are hopeful. He said they are looking for a score draw, that they are looking, both sides feel ready and able to compromise, that one side being able to claim victory is not a good thing, that both sides are prepared to move. So watch this space, but of course not only the deadline of the 28th of October, also next April will be the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which of course led to peace in Northern Ireland after decades of turmoil. Now, President Joe Biden is going to be visiting, and on both sides there is a really heartfelt desire to get this resolved in advance of this date. No illusions about the challenges ahead and the complications. I did ask Simon Coveney whether perhaps the focus on maintaining the integrity of the EU single market, the avoidance of a north-south border, had meant that not enough attention had been paid to the difficulties of putting a border down the Irish Sea and the problems that would cause. He said that they had looked long and hard about this, but Chris Heaton-Harris also said that they hadn't quite appreciated how difficult the protocol would actually make things when it was implemented.
Catherine in central London, thank you so much for joining me from Lancaster House. Well, I'm joined in the studio by Henry Hill, Deputy Editor at Conservative Home. Henry, is there anything new in all of this, or have we been here before? Because I've heard about score draws before. Surely the one thing that needs to happen is that the Europeans need to give a mandate to their negotiators to change the protocol.
Well, I mean, yeah, you've taken the words right out of my mouth. You know, I've been talking to British government ministers about this for years.
Yeah.
We've seen them march up and down the hill. I've been told very solemnly that there are deadlines that they can't possibly pass. Those deadlines are passed. We've been around this before. The key question is the EU going to actually change the legal frames of reference which bind its negotiators? If it does that, that means there's real talks. But otherwise, this just looks like the Truss government has set fire to all of its political capital, no longer perhaps has the stomach for the fight that it might have had a couple of weeks ago, and is looking for a way out. And there are a lot of Conservatives who'll be worried about that.
Well, a lot of Conservatives and a lot of Unionists as well, Henry. I mean, obviously, when we hear apologies coming from one side and not a recognition from the Irish government about the way in which they negotiated the protocol by claiming there'd be violence on the border, there's no recognition of that at present.
No, of course not. I mean, it was always a disgraceful way to argue, is that if we have border infrastructure, it will be attacked by the IRA. Well, in which case, defend it, right? Like, the whole point of the peace process is that we don't have the shadow of the gunman in Northern Irish politics. So it was atrocious, and I think it was a good faith gesture by the Conservative MP, which I don't think has been reciprocated. But, of course, we all want a negotiated solution of some sort or another, but I remain deeply sceptical that we're going to see the sort of change that I think you or I would want to see to protect Northern Ireland's integral place in the United Kingdom and respect the vote that it took part in for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union.
Absolutely. I'm afraid I share your scepticism, but we're going to move on now, and we're going to, after the break, or after the news, I should say, households and businesses might face planned 3-hour power outages this winter to ensure the national grid does not collapse. I'll be joined by Derek Lickerish, Chairman of Utility Energy and former COO of EDF. But first, here's Rhiannon with your news headlines.
Thank you, Arlene. It's 3:31, your top stories from the GB newsroom. And some breaking news in the last few minutes. A man seen brandishing a knife in Derby has died after being shot by police. We can cross live to GB News reporter Will Hollis, who's at the scene for us. Will, what more can you tell us?
Yes, well, a man has been confirmed to have died in hospital after being shot by armed police officers. He was seen in a police station car park on Ascot Drive, which is the road just behind me, quite a busy road in the south side of Derby. Police say, Derbyshire Constabulary say in a statement that at 9:55 a.m. today, officers were reported seeing a man armed with a knife in a secure car park off of Ascot Drive. Armed police officers were sent to the scene, and at 10:03 a.m. a police firearm was discharged. The man, whose identity is unknown, sustained a gunshot injury, and East Midlands Ambulance Service were requested to attend. They continue to say that officers administered first aid until paramedics attended the scene, and that he was taken to hospital but was pronounced dead. Now, officers are continuing to try and identify the next of kin, and the Independent Office for Police Conduct has been informed. But this is a very busy part of Derby, and I'm sure plenty of people will be shocked and wondering what exactly has happened here today.
Well, thank you very much, Will Hollis, there for us in Derby. The UK and Ireland have said they'll work at trying to resolve the stalemate over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Following a meeting of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference in London, both parties reaffirmed their commitment to reinstate an executive at Stormont by October the 28th. Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris says he'll call an election if an executive isn't formed. Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney says his country's now in a different space with the UK, with a genuine effort from both sides to resolve the issues. The US president says the world is facing the biggest threat of nuclear Armageddon since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. Joe Biden says Russia's president wasn't joking when he threatened to use nuclear weapons after suffering setbacks in Ukraine. It follows a warning from Vladimir Putin that he'd use all means necessary to protect Russian soil, which he says now includes 4 recently annexed Ukrainian regions. And over 3,000 more people died than usual in England and Wales this summer as the UK endured record temperatures. That's the highest figure since 2004. Most of the deaths were those aged 65 or over, and many happened during the hottest days towards the end of July. The data comes from a report from the Office for National Statistics and the UK Health Security Agency. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. It's back to the briefing with Arlene Foster in just a moment.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to the briefing this afternoon. Well, President Biden has warned that the risk of nuclear Armageddon is at its highest level since 1962, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The war in Ukraine is continuing to rage on, with Ukrainian forces making inroads into the recently annexed territories. According to the UK intelligence, captured Russian equipment now makes up a significant proportion of Ukrainian military hardware. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He's the former commander of the United States Army in Europe. Lieutenant General, thank you so much for joining us. And I just wanted to speak to you this afternoon to get your assessment of where we are with the conflict in Ukraine, because we saw last week, of course, the annexation of those 4 regions. But this week we've seen certainly a pushback from Ukraine. Is that what you feel as well?
Hey, Arlene, thank you. First of all, the sham referenda and the illegal annexations are not going to have any effect. Ukrainian forces are moving forward. They have achieved what I would consider irreversible momentum. I expect that they're going to push Russian forces back to the 23 February line by the end of this year, and that they'll have liberated Crimea sometime by the summer next year, if not sooner. Russian forces are, in some places, even collapsing. And these things can pick up momentum. So right now, as long as the West continues to support Ukraine the way we have been and deliver what we've promised, then I am very optimistic about how this is going to turn out.
My goodness, that would be an incredible turnaround to take back Crimea as well as those regions that he has so-called annexed. Because, of course, they're moving through some of those regions now, aren't they? In Donetsk, for example, they've made tremendous ground.
Yes, I mean, the irony of literally within hours of President Putin with this big, huge, ridiculous ceremony they had in Moscow, within hours, Liman was liberated. So this is happening faster than the Russians can create new fairy tales about what's going on. The partial mobilization, which was rolled out, the way it was rolled out showed it was so poorly managed. It showed that this decision was late to have any effect, and it was probably a compromise to throw a bone to the hard-wing, ultra-nationalists on the right of President Putin, but yet he's trying to still convince his own population that he's in control, things are going fine. And so what you get is, of course, this mess with 500,000 Russian military-age males leaving the country. They have no stomach for this. They don't want to be a part of it. And so the unlucky 200,000 or however many actually end up showing up, we've all seen the pictures of what's happening to them. No food, not a proper place to live, and there's no training. And they'll get sent into combat untrained, which is criminal.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, your president had some quite frightening analysis in terms of the nuclear threat from Putin, where he talked about, he wasn't bluffing about his use of nuclear weapons. What's your assessment of the threat? Because I know people are very anxious about that.
Yeah, this was important. Of course, there is a threat. President Putin doesn't care how many thousands of people may die. That he's been responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent Ukrainians over the past many months. And so we have to take the threats seriously. I think what my president was doing, he was signaling to the Kremlin that we take the threat serious and we're serious. He has made it clear to the Kremlin publicly and privately that we are prepared to act decisively. China's watching, North Korea's watching, Iran is watching. So the United States, there's no doubt, will act decisively if Russia should make the terrible miscalculation that somehow they could use a nuclear weapon of some sort in Ukraine. Now, having said all that, I believe it's unlikely. I think the Kremlin has gotten the message. They know that there are zero upsides for them should they use a nuclear weapon of any type. I think that the people around President Putin know that they have no chance, zero chance of anything approaching normalcy in the post-Putin era if they don't stop him from doing this. I see a widening gap between Putin and the military would have to be involved if there was going to be use of a tactical nuclear weapon that's much different than, say, the strategic ballistic missiles that would be used. Tactical nuclear weapons, there's a lot of other things that have to happen. I don't think the Army is going to support that.
Well, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your thoughts this afternoon. Henry, I'm going to come to you now for your thoughts on what's been happening in Ukraine. It's quite incredible to listen to the Lieutenant General there talk about taking back Crimea. I mean, who would have thought that?
I mean, it still seems difficult to credit in some ways. I think actually this is one of the big miscalculations that Putin has made with his recent annexations, because previously there was a clear difference in legal status between both the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk and the occupied territories, and Crimea, which was annexed in 2014, was legally considered not by anyone but Russia, but as an integral part of the Russian Republic. And I think that there would have been people in the West who would have said, look, we can only push Putin so far. We'll obviously reclaim, we'll go back to the February borders, but actually invading what Russia considers to be sovereign Russian territory is a line too far.
Well, we did nothing at the time.
Well, quite. but now Ukraine is taking back sovereign Russian territory every time it takes a new village. And so that clear dividing line with Crimea has gone. I do worry, obviously there is hopefully gaps opening up between Putin and some of the more sensible elements of the Russian regime. I do worry that they would still consider Sevastopol, which they all consider to be a historic Russian city, to be a line that they're not prepared to cross necessarily, and that would be an escalation of the war. But nonetheless, it's considering where we were in February, and where we thought we'd be now, it's absolutely remarkable how well Ukraine is doing.
It's incredible, absolutely. And it's something we'll continue to keep an eye on very closely here on GB News. But I'm going to turn to another issue which is concerning a lot of people across the UK, and that's, of course, energy. Because the National Grid has made a stark warning that the worst-case scenario this winter could see homes without power for 3 hours each day. It comes despite the Prime Minister previously ruling out energy rationing at the final leadership hustings last month. The Prime Minister has placed energy support, of course, at the top of her agenda, having announced a £150 billion support package as one of her first policies. Well, now I'm joined by Derek Lickorish, the chairman of Utility. I call it Utilita. Is it Utilita? Derek, you can put me right on all of this energy. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. What do you make of this announcement that in the worst case scenario, we'll have to lose 3 hours a day? I mean, it makes a lot of people very anxious when they hear that sort of talk.
It does indeed, and we are Utilita. So you were saying it quite correctly. I've been in the industry for a very long time, and I remember the 70s when we have rolling cutouts, and I know what they're like. National Grid has been putting forward its view of the winter for at least the last 20 years. And there's always been a scenario around where you could lose supply if certain things happened. And as you correctly said, this is a worst case scenario, but the base case is that things will be okay. But there's no doubt there is a heightened risk, and there are all the ingredients for a perfect storm. As we know that the gas, as we've just been hearing about Putin, the gas situation is far from being resolved, so that's an uncertainty. Then we have in France, there are a number of issues with a lot of their nuclear fleet being offline at the moment. France will rely on energy from other parts of Europe to get them through. And of course, we have our own challenges back here. But the base case is that we shouldn't have any interruptions. And of course, we hope that there will not be. So what's my take on it? The risk is increased. The probability, we will have to wait and see. And none of us know. And the Prime Minister, when she said there wouldn't be any rationing, doesn't know either. But we all hope for the best, but we plan for the worst. And that's the right thing to do.
Yes, it is the right thing to do, but I'm a little bit surprised at the reticence of the government, given what they've said, to stop any advice about reducing energy consumption. What did you make of that today? Because, of course, it was a £15 million campaign that was going to be launched to tell people to cut down on their energy consumption, and the Prime Minister has decided not to go ahead with that. What did you make of that?
I was absolutely astonished, and I think this is another own goal. We've got to remember, at this point in time, it's not just about reducing energy for the risks associated with potential rolling cutouts. We've also got a cost of living crisis. The government has, as you rightly said, put forward a £150 billion package, but for every kilowatt hour that's not used, that is money that the government won't have to pay. So to say that they won't do it is inconsistent with that. It's inconsistent with what the industry has been trying to do for a long time, which is to talk energy efficiency into existence. We all know that the long-term view is that we must reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, and there's a transition that has to take place to get us from where we are today to renewable energy. But I think the overriding thing that concerns me most is the cost of living crisis. We have an awful lot of customers, somewhere between 10 to 14 million households, will really struggle this winter, even with all the help the government's going to give them, because the bills this winter are more than double they were at this time last year. So there is pressure on customers anyway to reduce consumption for those who can't afford it, and particularly now with the increased cost, despite the help the government has given.
Well, I have to say I agree with you, Derek. I was baffled why you wouldn't want to give out a message of energy efficiency at this particular point in time. Maybe it's because they don't want to be the nanny state. I understand that. But surely giving advice to people is not too much to ask.
Well, we know from the various campaigns that we've been running that customers are listening because they are concerned about the cost of living crisis. One or two bits of information I can share with you. We've run a very big campaign for a couple of years now about trying to get people to be smarter at home with certain things. And one of our most successful things has been to show customers that if you cook in different ways, you can save a lot of money. And what's brought that into stark reality is the money you can save with an air fryer, for example. You can cook a roast dinner for around 68 pence on an air fryer versus £3.78 in an oven. So there's a huge amount of energy to save there, and an air fryer will pay for itself in about 75 days. That's just one small example of where customers can save money, and there are plenty of other things too. And we know from a campaign that we've launched in the last few days, we've had a lot of interest. We are going to run sessions in schools and in local communities on how to save energy. And if customers would like to, or particularly schools and other educational establishments, if they'd like to get in touch with us through education@utilita.co.uk, we can help them with all the energy saving tips that we think we can put together for them and save them a lot of money.
Well, Derek, thank you for putting that out there for everybody that's watching and listening today. I think that's really, really helpful. And thanks for joining me this afternoon. So, Henry,
thank you,
what do you make of this warning by National Grid and the fact that the government doesn't want to advise people to cut down on their energy consumption, which I think is mad?
I mean, it is mad. You know, it is ridiculous. It is a worst case scenario. You know, people my age have never actually lived through rolling blackouts and so on. But it is vitally important because for people like me were very lucky. If there was a 3-hour blackout, that would be inconvenient.
Yes.
But there are people for whom it would represent real hardship, if not danger. And so it would make perfect sense to spend what is a very small amount of money. If Liz Truss is worried about, her libertarian credentials, there are other things she can do. She could lift the ban on menthol cigarettes and then do this instead.
Yeah.
It's a clear example of where there are these ideological preoccupations which are perfectly legitimate.
Yes.
It's okay to be a small state conservative. Liz Truss has that right. But there are times and places. And this is one of the places where, if you're going to be spending a vast sum of money subsidising everyone's energy bills, spending an absolutely trivial sum of money advising them how to keep them down is just a no-brainer. And it's extraordinary that the government has chosen not to do it.
I think it's the message it sends out is really poor. I mean, nobody's forcing it on people, but the advice, I think, is really useful.
Because lots of people just want to reduce their energy consumption anyway, and so it would just be helpful.
Yeah, I can't understand it personally. But anyway, we're going to move on now to talk about another energy issue, which is that the oil-producing nations of OPEC have said that they will reduce their oil output by 2 million barrels per day. And with war raging in Europe, there had been hopes that OPEC would instead boost production to alleviate the rising cost of energy. The move has sparked a diplomatic divide. The White House said that President Biden was disappointed by the short-sighted decision. Well, joining me now to discuss the geopolitical ramifications of this move is Dr. Neil Quilliam. He's the Managing Director of Azure Strategy and an Associate Fellow of Chatham House. Neil, I mean, is this a surprise? Because we knew that President Biden had visited Saudi Arabia about 3 months ago and he was asking them to help with energy security. This seems to have now come and they're basically saying we're going to reduce energy production.
I mean, I think the depth of the cut is the surprise. I think most of us, it had been signalled that the cut was going to be about 1.5 million barrels a day. Even that was a little... massively concerning. So yes, it came as a surprise, but I don't think Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia, and his fist bump at the time actually did much to sort of restore the nature of the relationship. I think that, there are still tensions between the Biden administration and the Crown Prince, and those sort of tensions haven't been allayed. So it's unsurprising, that the White House is definitely more than disappointed about this.
And we're being told by OPEC, which of course includes Saudi Arabia and Russia, that they're doing this to stabilise prices. But I know a lot of people will be concerned that they'll actually rise prices, particularly at the petrol pumps.
I mean, definitely. I mean, it's going to feed through at the petrol pumps. It's going to feed through from inflation as well, certainly. But it's not just a political decision. I mean, obviously, as we said, the Biden administration is actually reeling from this, and European leaders are also very, very discomforted. But there is an economic logic to it from OPEC. It's not just to satisfy sort of, Russia, there is concern amongst those countries that recession is coming, and they want to take some of this kind of what they will consider to be surplus out of the market, so the price doesn't suddenly slump or dump down to 30 or 40 barrels a day. But obviously, we've seen a rebound in price from $88 a barrel Brent to, it's hovering around 93, 94 at the moment, and that's going to feed through to consumers right across Europe.
Yeah, and I think people were hoping that the price of petrol was going to go in the opposite direction. It had gone down a little bit, but they will be concerned coming up to this time of the year and everything else that's going around in energy, Neil, that this is going to add to their woes.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt. This cut is going to have a material impact on all of our lives in Europe. Prices have already gone up at the petrol pump. It's going to stay there for some time unless recession coming from China really begins to take its effect or impact. But we're going to feel this, and it's going to feed through, as I said, through inflation all the way through the system. So we're going to be putting our hand in our pocket many more times than we would like.
Well, sorry to end on a negative note, but thank you to Dr. Neil Quillam there for joining us to explain what has happened with OPEC. I mean, very briefly, because we're running out of time, Henry, this is something that is not welcome at all.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And I mean, you think about all of the effort the US has put into cultivating Saudi Arabia, arming and modernising its military. It just emphasises how important it is that we increase domestic energy production, maximise use of the North Sea, but also stuff here, onshore wind, nuclear power. There is a world in which the United Kingdom is much less exposed to this global market that is mostly run by a collection of terrible countries, but it is a world in which we have invested properly in domestic energy production, which we haven't done for a long time.
And of course, we should note today that Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Business Secretary, has announced a new licensing round in oil and gas today. But I mean, as well as that, as you rightly say, there's nuclear, there's onshore wind, and there's hydrogen as well, of course, which is something that we should talk about as well. But we've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm delighted that you've been able to join with me here on The Briefing. The show's back every Friday from 3 p.m. And coming up next, it's Nana Akua, and I hope that you can join her as well.
Hello again, Aidan McGivern here with the latest forecast from the Met Office. A spell of heavy rain and strong winds is crossing the country this afternoon. Showers following, and then all of that clears later, with most places seeing a dry and clear night. But an active weather front is causing some lively weather. With that front, we're seeing a spell of heavy rain, gusty winds, those winds really picking up as the heavy rain pushes through, and it clears southeast England around late evening, followed by a marked temperature drop and lighter winds with clear spells for many overnight, and as a result temperatures will fall away. Now there will still be some showers in the north and northwest, but where we see the clear spells elsewhere, those temperatures dipping in sheltered spots down to 5 or even down to 2 to 3 Celsius. A bright start though, despite that chill in the air first thing this weekend. Plenty of sunshine for many